Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk a little bit about integrating aspects of world building into the narrative and some of the issues that can arise with that, because it's not always just about here's this really cool element and I got to put it in the story world. Sometimes those elements have to have a level of integration that they need to be part of the story world, and the logical ramifications of that technology or that power or that magic uh, need to be incorporated into the story world to make it make sense. And when aspects of that don't necessarily happen, that can cause not necessarily plot holes, but problems. But also the way that narrative framing and an artistic choice about a story world, or a narrative choice about a story world, can mean that the narrative logic with which a story world functions is different to our own, and that isn't necessarily a detriment. And the reason I want to talk about this is because we spend so much time breaking these things apart, talking about them as if they are completely separate elements. But it's how they work together in a narrative that actually make the narrative work. A narrative is more than the sum of its parts. So the first way to approach this, and I thought this is a nice example, because spaceship battles in science fiction movies or science fiction TV, this actually illustrates quite an interesting point. So if you think back to Star Wars: A New Hope and the trench run that they do to blow up the Death Star, spoilers for Star Wars, they blow up the Death Star. But you have the X-Wing, and the X-Wing is modeled very much, it looks science fictional, it looks futuristic or retro-futuristic, depending on your view of it now. But it's modeled after an aircraft. And there are scenes where it flies in atmosphere. But that modeling, that paradigm of storytelling, that the space battles are going to be aerial battles, is something that dominates the narrative perspective. And what I mean by this is when they fly down into that trench, it becomes very much the Death Star is the ground and space is up. But when we think about it, that's not actually true, because they are in space. The gravity exerted by the Death Star is not going to be significant enough to affect the flying of the X-Wing. So they're not flying through space. Aerodynamics are not the thing that is dictating the movement of the X-Wing. And when we have that movement of the camera, and it shows them like wheeling and moving through space in their dogfighting battles, that was storyboarded from war footage and naval or aircraft footage of dogfighting in the sky. And I think it was World War II, maybe, or it might have been later. But they used footage of aerial combat to model those scenes. So very much the paradigm that Lucas was using was space combat is aerial combat. And of course, aerial combat happens in atmosphere. And that dictates a lot of movements and how things happen. And that's what we see in Star Wars. But in the trench run, we get this wonderful moment where we suddenly realize it is space, and it's not the same as in aerial combat, because the Millennium Falcon arrives at the end and comes straight down basically and unexpectedly deals with the TIE fighters. And that wouldn't really have been possible in aerial combat to the same extent. So taking that paradigm, when we look at Battlestar Galactica, the TV show, the original TV show that kindly paid homage to Star Wars or ripped off Star Wars, just depending on how you look at it. But they did a very similar thing with the Vipers. Again, a lot of the space combat, when they're flying in space, these vast distances, empty space all around, but so much of it is relayed and told to us as the viewer as an aerial battle, as if we're watching planes flying through the air. Whereas if you think about it, if you consider it, when you're in space, that's a completely different environment. Why would you use the same tactics? Why would you use the same methodologies? Why would you use the same approaches and fight the same way in a weightless environment than you would when you have to deal with gravity, when you have to deal with aerodynamics, when you have to deal with the forces and movement that you would have in air and air resistance and the banking maneuvers that you can do with that. Those are all considerations of aerial combat, not of space combat. But that's what we have. And because so many science fiction shows like Battlestar Galactica or Buck Rogers, they used aerial combat as the model. And that's what we got used to very much as the paradigm of how space battles work. But that's not the only way to do it. If you think of Star Trek in The Wrath of Khan, the end battle sequence is this very tension-filled battle between Khan and Kirk in their various ships. And it is very much told not as an aerial combat dogfight, the way that all of these other shows had been doing it, but was very much a naval battle, but specifically submarine battle. And we see that with Star Trek, they took, instead of having the fighter dogfight approach, they use a much more naval approach of these big ships that are, destroyers and battleships and frigates. And that idea of a large scale naval battle, that was the paradigm that they were using rather than the small scale aerial combat dogfight. But in Wrath of Khan, they actually, in that sequence, go for a submarine battle. And that is fascinating because obviously in aerial combat, there is vertical movement. There is movement around all of these things. But in a naval battle with these big ships, it's much more static and on a single plane. But with a submarine battle, you add that verticality back in, you add the depths in, that they could be at different levels through this, as well as all of the other positioning that you would have across a plane. So it was very interesting that in Wrath of Khan, they went for this submarine battle. But if you don't have the high octane, high adrenaline dogfight, where's the tension coming from? And you think of all those classic submarine films like Das Boot, about that sneaking and are they going to find us? Can we hide them? Can we sneak up on them? Are we be able to get a shot off before they do? That is how the tension is built in those films and in those stories. It's a very different type of tension, but it's a very understandable and relatable form of combat. Like, we can wrap our head around it. We just think of space then as being a giant liquid and them floating around in the liquid. And we can kind of encapsulate that. We can understand why that would function as a paradigm for space battle. And in fact, in a lot of respects, it's more accurate than thinking about it in terms of aerial combat. And it was actually I think there was Wing Commander based on the old computer game. And I'm fairly sure it was a film with Freddie Prinze Jr. Going way back in time. Not exactly the world's greatest cinematic masterpiece, but again, they looked at it very much as naval combat with that submarine element. And that's how they played with it. That's how they built out the tension. And it's a wonderful way of doing space combat that is different to the fighty, shooty, fly air combat that we were so used to. So it made itself feel distinct. Even though, it's still space combat. It's still something we don't really know about. We don't know the best way to do it. And when we move into, say, things like Babylon 5 and even the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, they went back to a sort of combined forces approach, because in Battlestar Galactica, you had the large ship, the Galactica, and then the fighter screen that flew out from it that had the dogfights away from the main ship, and then the main ships would engage. Again, this sort of more combined arms, looking at it in terms of large scale combat on a naval sense with your aerial combat added in. But one of the things that both Battlestar Galactica, the reboot, and Babylon 5 did was they started to pay attention to the fact that space is much more about acceleration and deceleration, momentum, spinning in place, doing all of these things, because you aren't dealing with air resistance. So the Star Fury that they had in Babylon 5 had at the four corners of its sort of X frame that it had. It didn't have wings, it just had this sort of X frame and a cockpit. But it had its major engines at the back, but it also had little engines at the front. And so they would spin by cutting off the majority of the engines, and then they would activate one in one corner and one on the opposite on the other side. So it would actually spin on its axis. So they would be flying forward, spin on their axis. So now, while they're still traveling in that direction, they're now facing backwards. They would shoot the person behind them and then flip again. And the pilot was always upright, because there is no up in space when you are weightless. There's no gravity, there's no down, there's no up. And so they played with that. They played with momentum. And when we got to the Battlestar Galactica reboot, they went even further with this, but they were still using that aerial combat paradigm for the dogfights between the Cylons and the humans. But it was interesting that it was now bringing in these bigger ships as a major component of the battle, and understanding that sort of combined arms approach. So we could say it's becoming slightly more complicated, but it's still pretty much modeled on what happens on Earth. It's still that approach. But we buy into it. It makes sense. It's a way of taking something we don't understand, space combat, and giving it to us in a way that is logical, that is consistent, and that the narrative accepts as normal. And it relays it that way consistently to us. And you go, there's the narrative logic. That's how this story world functions. It's absolutely fine. It makes it feel real. And one of the ways that Battlestar Galactica actually really sold this was in one episode, they have the giant ship, the Galactica, go drop into atmosphere. And you see the ship falling through the sky because it's a very heavy ship and it's not exactly aerodynamic. And before it hits the ground, it jumps. It uses its blink drive or its jump drive, and it jumps out of the system. And when it leaves, all of the air rushes into the vacuum because it has all of this displaced air. The ship has suddenly teleported, and therefore there is a vacuum that sucks all of the air in. And moments like that sell the authenticity of what is happening so well. They are incredibly well done. And when you have moments like that, you go, yes, I can buy into this reality. I can buy into this story world. And that's taking an element, a fantastic element like a teleportation device. And when you displace an object of that size, understanding that it has ramifications and repercussions, because air will rush into the sudden void, the vacuum of where that object was. That is excellent storytelling, because you believe it, you can feel it, it makes sense. But when we move on, say, to something like The Expanse, they kind of do away with the dogfighting, aerial combat, or even naval combat, and really try to imagine what space combat would be, working out arcs and trajectories, working out the vast distances that are involved in space, going, they are hundreds of kilometers away. So there's no point in shooting at them. We have to shoot at where they are going to be, because you have to take into account how long it's going to take for your missile or your bullets or whatever to get there. And so much of that gets worked into The Expanse as a TV show, because they really try to encapsulate a version of what space warfare would actually be like. Again, taking into account acceleration and deceleration, flipping a ship around so it is, you don't need engines on the front to try and slow you down. You just flip your ship around so it's facing the opposite direction and try to accelerate. So it's a bit like driving along in a car, doing a 180-degree spin, so you're now traveling backwards and then accelerating forwards. You're still going to keep traveling backwards for a bit before your car can go forwards. That's what they do with the spaceships. And there's no friction. It's all done with momentum. And it was very, very clever. And they work all of this stuff out, and it gives it an element of authenticity, an element of verisimilitude, that we can buy into this universe. We can buy into some of the more ludicrous aspects of this universe, because some of them really speak to, well, they got the science essentially right for a layperson like me. They got the science right in that. Therefore, this makes everything else that much more believable. But to go back then, let's take an example of using the logic of a story world to both justify something and then show it as a poor example. So, again, going back to Star Wars. Star Wars is fun. Lightsabers, laser swords, really cool swords in the future. Is this a good idea? No, it's an incredibly bad idea. Lightsabers make no sense in the Star Wars universe, except lightsabers are used by people with superhuman abilities, a limited form of prescience, so they can sort of, a couple of seconds into the future, they know where things are going to be. So they can move the lightsaber to that position before it gets there. And it makes their reaction time so tiny. They have superhuman reflexes and strength and speed and agility that they can do all of these things. So they're not only talented sword wielders or blade masters, whatever you want to call them, but the Jedi have superhuman abilities. Because they have superhuman abilities, that allows us to look at them using a lightsaber and go, yeah, I can buy that. But if the lightsaber had just been used by a normal human in that world that has laser guns and bowcasters and all sorts of different projectile and laser and plasma weapons, the lightsaber makes no sense, because sure, it can deflect a bolt, but two guys firing at you and you're going to hit every single bolt that's moving at nearly the speed of light, or at least the speed of sound. That you can see why that would actually break the narrative immersion. It wouldn't make sense. It would be really problematic. And you would hope that the narrative would come up for a reason why this makes sense, because it wouldn't otherwise. But the Jedi having superpowers gives us that reason. It explains why they use them, because they can. Normal people can't, but the Jedi can because of their powers. But then let's look at Dune and Frank Herbert's Dune. And they have swords in this far future world, but they don't have superpowers. Why does that make sense? And here we have Herbert doing something very, very clever. He invents a technology, the shield. And because of this shield, projectile weapons will not work. And because projectile weapons won't work, you need to fall back on some other form of weapon, because people are still going to try and kill each other. So they use swords. They use long bladed weapons. They use short swords and long daggers. And the way that Herbert explains the kinetic shielding is that fast moving objects will hit it and stop and won't penetrate the shield. Now, what happens to all that kinetic energy? That's something that is usually fudged over a little bit, but let's just say it's dispersed across the shield, and then because of that energy can't actually be destroyed, it actually goes to power the shield, and it's a self-fulfilling cycle. Let's just say that's how it works. But kinetic energy is immediately stopped because it's traveling too quickly. But if you hit them with a sword, while your initial very fast strike would be stopped because of the kinetic energy, you're then in contact with the shield, and you can slowly pull down and slice, and that cuts through the shield. So it's the slow blade penetrates the shield. But obviously you can't just lunge at someone very, very slowly. They would just walk, amble out of the way, and then bop you on the back of the head. So it makes sense to use weapons with blades on them, that you can do a fast strike that stops the weapon, and then you slowly draw down to cut into your opponent. We can understand the logic. The narrative has given us a reason to buy into this. And when we have that established, when we have that as a narrative logic that's established in the story world, this fictional element, this far future society, now we know why they have a whole bunch of soldiers armed with swords. It makes sense. We can believe it. It creates a believable, immersive reality. And he even goes one step further and says, well, laser guns do exist, but the reason people don't use them is because there's an interaction between the laser gun and the shield that is devastating on both ends. So it's a suicide weapon, and therefore you don't use that. It's much more effective to have your soldiers armed with melee weapons. And we can buy into that. Now, obviously, if you start scratching at the surface of it and you start digging down, we can think of applications. You go, but you have basically elements of drones. So why not send a laser gun mounted on a drone quite far away from where your encampment is and start firing at the enemy? Because then when the explosions go off, you're not injured and you've destroyed the enemy. We can think of elements like that, and stuff like that could work into the various stories in the various world, but that's why they don't do it, because it is so dangerous, it is so devastating, and it can cause massive repercussions. So it's not that every single concept is absolutely watertight. That's not what a story world has to go for. It has to go for a level of believability, a level of rationality within that story world, not necessarily our world, but the story world itself, a narrative logic, a cohesion about how the story world functions. So I want to talk about an element where we can see it in one of the story worlds I've just talked about, where it makes no sense whatsoever. And that is Stormtrooper armor. And again, visually stunning. You can see it's a great costume design, very evocative of the Nazis and fascism and the militaristic aspect. Great. Visually stunning, visually arresting. It looks great on the screen. But what does that armor do? Because in the Star Wars films, they don't stop blasters. When Han Solo shoots at them once with his handgun, it goes through their armor. When they shoot at them with a rifle, it goes through their armor. When they're hit with a lightsaber, it goes through their armor. What does their armor stop? It doesn't stop anything. Therefore, it is not armor. It's a silly costume. When we see them being attacked by large teddy bears or Ewoks, the Ewoks hit them with flint spears. So these are miniature teddy bears armed with sticks that bop and stab stormtroopers, and they are dealt with, even though they are wearing space age armor. The armor protects them from nothing. It doesn't protect them from a teddy bear lobbing a rock at them. And this is where you find the narrative logic breaks down. Because as soon as you look at, you're trying to buy into this idea that it's armor, and yet it is absolutely useless as armor. It doesn't function as armor. It's just costuming. And the only reason it is there, the only reason the narrative shows us it being there, is to be visually arresting. And it doesn't have a function within the universe. It doesn't work. It doesn't operate according to the narrative logic of the universe. And this, I hope, illustrates you can have a cool idea, you can implement it into a world, but if you're not aware of the ramifications, if you're not working out how it actually interacts with that fictional reality that you're creating, you can create problems. So very lastly, very quickly, I'm going to get on to obviously one of the science fiction shows that I have major problems with in terms of how they do this, and that's Discovery, Star Trek Discovery. So season 4 has just started, and during season 3, they introduced the idea of the personal transporter. But transporters have always been in Star Trek IP, I hear someone say. Why do you have your problem with this? And the problem I have is in all of the iterations of Star Trek, they had the concept of the transporter. And it was great. It was a way to move people around vast distances, to get them from place to place without constantly having shuttles and things like that. It was a really convenient device. And the way that they implemented it was there was a control room. There was a person standing there, and you flipped out your little communicator, 2 to beam up, 3 to beam up, beam me to this place, whatever. And you could either, the person in control room could lock onto your signal, they would beam you to the transporter room, or they would do what they called a site-to-site transport. They would essentially beam you to the transporter room and then back out to where you wanted to go without rematerializing you in the transporter room. So skipping over the whole existential dread of being dematerialized and essentially killed, and then a strange clone of your body being reconstructed in a different place that clearly your soul isn't attached to, and you're a soulless monster clone. Stepping aside that, what we had here was you had a verbal command and you had a mechanical activation sequence. And obviously this brought up issues within Star Trek, because they would have episodes where something was happening and you go, well, they could just transport and they could get around this very easily. So one of the things that started to be worked in were reasons why the transporters weren't working or couldn't be used. You know, they had that pseudoscience gibberish of, oh, the ionic radiation from the cosmic cloud is destabilizing our retro-burning phalanges. And that was kind of enough. The director knew about it, the writer knew about it, it was added in. Yes, we've thought about it. We know that a transporter would solve all of these issues. We're getting out ahead before it comes into play in the narrative. before any of that happens, before someone's going to go, oh, here's a dilemma, they establish early on that they cannot use transporters in that way. And for that episode, they stick to it because they have created a rule within the narrative universe. They've created a rationale for why things happen in a certain way. So now that I've established that, why do I have a problem with the personal transporters? And the reason I have a problem with it is they are no longer voice activated. There's no manual activation. They just work. That's it. It's instantaneous teleportation across vast distances. Because remember, they have them beaming from a planet onto a starship, which is in orbit around the planet. This is a big distance. They have them teleporting in that, but without having to physically activate the teleportation device. They don't touch it. They don't touch a button, the communicator built into their badge. They don't have a little communication device. They don't touch a thing on their wrist to signal they want to teleport. And even if they did that, how does it know where they want to go? How are they programming in where they want to go? In all of those earlier iterations of this, in all of the iterations, there had to be beam me to, and someone then had to find that place and beam them to it. Even if it was automated, beam me to the canteen. You still have to tell them where you want to go, even if it's an automated system and there's no person anymore. But in Discovery, they have instantaneous teleportation of people that is individual to them, that is not connected to a transporter room and a control of any kind. And it's not activated physically, nor is it activated by voice, because we have plenty of scenes in season 3 and in season 4 now where people are just walking along and their teleporter activates. And this is entirely problematic because there is no way to explain this. It's not been explained in the show how these things work. It's just a cool visual effect. The problem is this has added in a new technology to the story world, and the ramifications of it have not been thought out, are not well understood, and are not utilized consistently. So, as an example of this, if I was going to try and explain how the personal teleporter worked without the person saying where they wanted to go or activating it mechanically, you go, okay, well, maybe there's a strong AI in the teleporter, so it's handling all of those things so they don't have to program it. Great. But they don't say anything. Oh, so the AI is reading their mind. So now to explain this device, I've had to invent a telepathic AI that is controlling it. And then the ramifications of a telepathic AI in the Star Trek universe is quite frightening, because if an AI goes rogue, it's just going to teleport everyone with their personal teleporters into space and let them die. So there's a problem with it. You go, oh, but AP, as long as they're using it consistently. And you have lots of scenes where people are talking and then they say, all right, I'm away now. And they leave, they take 6 steps and then just teleport. But they don't touch anything, they don't say anything, they just teleport and apparently have magically appeared where they wanted to go, as if they wished themselves there. And the reason this is a problem is in season 1, or episode 1 of season 4, the opening episode, the very first sequence, they have 2 characters running away who are being shot at, and it's, we can teleport you out of there, and over their communicator. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. Now, first of all, they didn't need someone to teleport them out of there. They have personal teleporters. We know that teleportation will work. These transporter beams will work here. So we know that this technology can function. It's not that there's a weird disturbance in the force that's stopping them. So it will work. So they're running and being shot at. And we are meant to believe that their lives are in danger, except we don't. You don't believe their lives are in danger. And they even make a joke of it. They should have shot us by now. You know, yeah, they should have, because you're about 20 feet away from them and they can see you and they're shooting you with lasers. And neither one of you seems concerned about this. That all you have to do is activate your transporter and you can get away. But they don't do that. They want this chase sequence with lots of things exploding. Then, when they eventually get to their ship and they're standing on their ship, they use their personal teleporters to teleport into the ship. So they do work. They work on the planet. The Discovery could have beamed them up at any time. They could have beamed themselves up at any time with their personal teleporters. So none of the sequence works. The only reason this sequence is there is because they want a sequence where you can have so-called witty banter as they are being shot at. But the technology that they have at their disposal negates the whole reason for the scene. Their choices of what they choose to do to try and get away from this situation, where they summon a escape poddy thing to get into so they can fly away and escape, doesn't make any sense, because they have personal teleportation devices that can get them to the ship, can get them to their ship, to the Discovery, could get them behind their attackers. They could use it in any sort of way that they wanted. But that technology is not integrated into the story world. It's used as a flashy device, and people, be it the showrunners, the writers, or whoever, does not consider the ramifications of this technology in the show. Sorry. And this is a problem because it ruins the suspension of disbelief. It reduces the authenticity and verisimilitudinous nature of the story world. It redefines things as spectacle rather than having narrative weight. Because what is introduced in that world, saying this is a thing that exists, this is one of the tools the characters have to solve problems. If they then have a problem that can be solved by that tool, and it gets built out into this whole, oh, how are we going to solve this? You go, literally, you can just teleport. Like you have the tool. You used it earlier on in the show. You use it later on in the show. You use it later on in this scene. Why is this difficult? It reduces our belief in the narrative. And that is something I have a problem with. So world building is not just about the fantastic elements. It's not just about these really cool elements. It's about ensuring that these cool elements feel part of the world, that they're integrated into the story world, and that they make sense within the narrative logic of that story world that has been created. If it is just fantastic elements dropped in and you go for the cool factor, the rule of cool, you have to have at least some rationale for them. It doesn't have to be enormously complex. Like Frank Herbert and the shields and the swords. When you start digging into that, you can find ways around it. You can find ways to manipulate it. And it kind of breaks apart a little bit. And the deeper down you go into the fundamentals of what's going on, it breaks apart even more. Jedi using lightsabers. As soon as you start picking apart how these things would work and what the function is and what level of how their reactions would have to work and how quick they would have to be and how far into the future they would have to see and what that means in terms of free will and predestination, it starts getting very complex and breaking apart. But as long as the rationale is there at a surface level and it's believable enough and it can withstand a wee bit of scratching on the surface to still hold up, you go, I can buy into that world. That's what suspension of disbelief is. It's not absolute idiocy of I'm going to ignore the things that the world has established, like in Discovery. You have these technologies, you use the technology, you use them in the same scenes. So I know they exist. Either address why you're not using them, find a reason why you can't use them, or rewrite your scene. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Talking about Discovery always gets my blood pressure up. But thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.